over to Nikki.
Great, thanks Meg. And thanks for the CTD for managing the tech side. Welcome to the WADE 2020 Education, Communication, and Outreach Eco Track. I'm Nikki Wolf. I'm one of the track coordinators along with Dana Bowers. We're really excited to have our first two presenters with us today. We have Laura Johnson, who's the communications coordinator from the Washington State Conservation Commission. And then we have Brian Cochrane also presenting, and he is the Habitat and Monitoring Coordinator from the Commission. And today we're going to hear from them about turning stats into stories, so going beyond the BMP to really engage your audience. So with that, please join me in welcoming Laura and Brian, and we'll have you guys share your screen.
Great, thank you Nikki and Meg and Dana for all your work to organize this track. Happy virtual WADE, everybody. I have not seen a share screen prompt yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let's see.
That's all right. Yeah, it's a different way of doing this, and I really miss all you guys. I look forward to when we can get together again. So let's see. My webcam is showing up really large, so I might stop sharing that for a second and make sure that you guys can see my screen there. I'll just go through kind of a quick overview of what Brian and I are going to talk about today, and you'll notice that the two of us had probably way too much fun putting these slides together. A couple of nerds united to create this for you. Apologies in advance. But it's great working with Brian. I come at our work from the communication and storytelling perspective. Brian's coming from technical expertise. And we did a session last year to talk about how to use visuals effectively to communicate our conservation work. And this year we want to talk more about turning stats into stories. And kind of the other kind of name for this presentation really could have been so what? Kind of getting to that so what question. So you've done X number of BMPs, so you assisted X number of landowners, so you put practices on X number of acres, so what? We all know the so what, we know the value of our work, but we need to be able to communicate that effectively to audiences who don't. And there's a lot of different audiences we could have designed this for. Brian and I decided to frame what we're going to talk about today around two different audiences. Brian's going to talk about the grant funder audience, and I'm going to speak from kind of a decision maker, leader position audience, somebody that you're wanting to get to support your district somehow, either financially or by a certain initiative or legislation, something like that. Brian, do you want to say a little bit about your experience as a grant reviewer, just to give some context of where you're coming from on that?
Sure, I've been both a grant reviewer and a grant applicant. Didn't do stellar in my first couple applications, but learned along the way. And then since I've been with the commission, I've been asked several times by other agencies, ecology and more or less EPA, it was ecology money, to assist them in some grant reviews, and also been part of the partnerships process as well. And so it really flips your thoughts about grant applications when you start to become a reviewer.
Yeah, and for me, I'm not often the one that's going into meetings with leadership. That's usually our policy team or our executive director, our commission members, some of our other conservation leader partners. But I am tasked, as I think some of you are, with creating some materials and messaging for them to take into those meetings or to send before those meetings. And so it's important for me, even if I'm not going to be the one delivering the message, to really have some understanding of what makes an effective story. How can I really equip the people who are going into those leaders with some good information and engaging information. So that's where I'm going to be coming from my experience doing that. For our staff to meet with legislators, for our staff to meet with member of Congress, and then just other partners who really we want to support our work. So we're going to start, since this is a presentation about storytelling, we're going to start with an example of a kind of a story, or at least one where context really matters. So once upon a time, there was a 2017-2019 budget for natural resources in Washington state that was $2 billion. Now, without any other information, you might not know what to make of that. For some, it might sound like, wow, $2 billion, that is a lot of money. For some, you might just not really know what to do with it. It might be sort of like, so what? So there's $2 billion for natural resources. What does that really mean? Well, if you provide some context, in 2017-2019, the Washington budget total was $89 billion. And natural resource was just that $2 billion, just a tiny little percentage of this $89 billion budget. And you also have to keep in mind that conservation districts and the commission are a tiny percentage of that tiny percentage of the budget. And we also know that often there's several shovel-ready projects in our conservation practice data system, CPDS, that go unfunded. For example, right now, I think there's over 220 different natural resource investment and shellfish projects that are valued at over $9 million, and they're ready to go, but we just don't have the funding for it. So once you add all that to the picture of this $2 billion natural resource budget, it kind of makes, I don't know about you, but it kind of makes me cranky. You get a cranky dragon. Because there's a lot of really good work that's just waiting to be funded, and why are we not getting more of that money? And that's what you're aiming for when you are providing stats and figures. You want not just to provide those numbers, but you want to elicit an emotional response, because that's what makes a story stick. That's what helps you stand out from all the other stats and figures and numbers that you're going to get. And so in this example, knowing that we're presenting this presentation today to an audience of people who really care about conservation and natural resources and know the importance of that work, that hearing that $2 billion natural resource figure in the framework of this larger $89 billion budget, and the tiny percentage of that goes to resources and the tinier percentage of that goes to our work, it might have a chance of getting kind of a cranky dragon response from you guys. And that's what you really just need to look for. So you've got your BMP stats, your metrics, all these different numbers that are going into your work. But the important thing is to put it through a context filter. You've got to provide context that makes it engaging and relatable and interesting to your specific audience in order to get that. You want to bring out the cranky dragon. It doesn't always have to be cranky dragon. It can be a happy one. It can be surprised, but I just really like the cranky dragon face in this presentation more than the others. And I gave you fair warning that this would be a nerdy presentation, so there you go. So we are going to go through some steps for you to start building your context filter to help elicit that emotional response and make your story stick, make them stand out from everybody else. And the first question, we're going to go through a few different questions to consider when you're building that context filter. And the first one, and you probably heard us talk about this before if you've been to any of the other sessions that I've done, or the one that Brian and I have done together, is really focusing on who is your audience, and getting just even some of the most basic information about your audience can help you frame your story and figure out what's going to get a reaction out of them. And you really can't do that until you start doing your research into who they are and what they care about. So where do you look for those audience clues? And I'm going to turn it over to Brian to talk about, for a grant, what that looks like.
So yeah, on the grant side, it's about asking yourself not just who is your audience, what does your audience want? and how do you pitch your project to meet their needs? And so the first thing, continuing the nerdy theme and going down a Python trail, ask yourself the 3 questions in order to cross the bridge of death. Who is your audience? And your audience in a grant scenario is always the grant funder, and secondarily the grant reviewer. The grant funder has a pot of money that they're offering to folks that can advance their mission. Typically, as a grant applicant, I think we get tunnel visioned into this place of, oh, I have this great project that I want somebody to pay for. And if we write the application from that perspective, we miss the emotional connection for the grant funder who says, this is perfect for our mission and our needs, which is really the place we want to try to end up, because then obviously we'll stand a better chance of being awarded the grant. So the grant funder always wants something in exchange for giving you their money. And so we need to do some research and understand more about that organization or that part of that organization and what their values and perspectives are. If it's ecology, they want water quality generally, or air quality or some other reduction in pollutants. If your project has a marginal gain in pollutant, you may have trouble really convincing them that spending money with your project is a better investment for them than spending money with somebody else's project. So the first thing is to understand who's funding and where they're coming from. The second thing to understand is that you're the subject matter expert on your project, but they're the subject matter expert on their mission, or they will probably hire some assistants for reviewers who are subject matter experts. And so you can only talk your way through your project so much because you're talking to an expert. And so I know we tend to just kind of pile on sometimes in grant applications about how great our project is. And at a certain point, for lack of a better term, the BS needle starts to tip into the red. So you have to be very careful and understand your audience is a very knowledgeable grant reviewer. The third thing to understand about your audience in a grant cycle is that they're trying to ask questions in order to distinguish which projects are really, really relevant and the best investment for them versus those projects that are not. And so sometimes we look at the questions and go, why are they asking that? It's, well, they're going to get a range of applications and they're trying to sort out which ones stack high and which ones stack low. And so the idea is to understand that we need to answer those questions in a way that's going to make us fall into the good pile and not further down the spectrum. So that's partly the idea of putting yourself into the place of your grant offerer's shoes. And that's something I know that, as a technical person, that's certainly not in my training. And I think, I don't want to be insensitive to broad generalizations, but at least speaking from personal, a data person is generally not gifted in the ability to step into somebody else's position. And it takes work and effort and thought. So that's why working with your outreach people, who generally are much better at that, can be really helpful if you're a technical writer applying for a grant. So I'm going to pass it back to Laura for the audiences on the political side, which is also a place that technical people don't do well.
Thanks,
or this
Brian.
technical person doesn't do well.
And you can just, I know that a lot of you have really strong and well-established relationships at this point with a lot of the local, state, and federal decision makers in your conservation district area. But even for those of us, again, like I don't go into those meetings. I don't have those personal relationships. But because I'm assisting with developing the materials for those meetings, it's really helpful for me just to get a general understanding of who these people are, how I can frame some of the data that I'm getting from our technical folks in a way that's going to resonate with them. And so I can turn to, if only Google was as fun as a crystal ball, I can turn to Google and ask just do some really basic research. So starting with what's their background? And that can be as easy as, just going to if it's an elected official, they'll have a website, and they will have their personal biography. Read that in its entirety, where they grew up, the type of town they grew up in, the jobs that they held before they came into office, or the jobs that they had before they're in whatever leadership role they're in now. The types of places that they've volunteered before can tell you a lot. As you all know, your supervisors, the supervisors of conservation districts, are there as volunteers because they're very passionate about conservation or some specific aspect of conservation. So understanding where they have volunteered or currently volunteer their time can tell you a lot about what they really, really care about. Same with their memberships, the associations they do or have belonged to. Also, what drives them, it's kind of related, building off of the previous question. Again, just looking on their website can tell you so much about the leader, their voting record, the bills and initiatives they've sponsored. Follow them on social media, follow them on Twitter, they're subscribed to their newsletter. They choose what to highlight and all those things. It'll give you a really good sense of what they're telling you in those, whatever they're sharing in those, in their social media and newsletter, what they want to focus on, what they really want to highlight. You can look up what committees they serve on, and then the issues when they were campaigning, if you can find any of the information about when they were campaigning for the position or applying for the position that they're in. What did they highlight as what they thought what were they driven to be in that position to do? And also finding out who they listen to. And that can be really helpful to do in person, asking in person who they listen to. But if you just need, a lot of us are pressed for time and need sort of a shortcut, so you can look up what organizations have endorsed them or supported them in some way. You can look up who they've worked with on certain issues. And you can also look at what kind of speaking engagements are they accepting in person, where they're going to take some of their time to show up at a certain event or a certain association's conference and give a talk, because that might also give you a sense of who they really value and see as an important voice to listen to. I wanted to show you an example of one way I've tried to do this, and again, it's very simple. It's not anything fancy. When our conservation leaders are going back, usually once a year, they go back to Washington, D.C. to speak to congressional leaders and federal agency leaders about conservation priorities in Washington state. And again, I'm not going to those meetings, but I am working on the materials that will be taken into those meetings and delivered to them. And all I do is I go to this is an example of a spreadsheet I created about congressional House representatives. And I'm not just tracking what conservation districts are within their congressional district. I'm looking at their websites to find from their biographies, from all those things I mentioned, what issues they seem to really care about and the committees they serve on, so that I can frame the same story a few different ways, just depending on what that audience member cares about. And I can pick, you guys are all awesome about submitting great annual report stories every year. In your future accomplishments, if I find out that our leadership is going into a meeting with somebody who really cares about local food systems, local farms, connecting low-income communities with healthy, nutritious foods, I can do a search from the current and past few years' annual reports to see if there's any conservation districts who have a story related to that issue in that annual report, and highlight that, because I know based on the research that that's what's most likely to get an emotional response from them, some kind of engagement from them. It's something that they care about. So once you've done that research, you can decide and just really clarify, what do you want that audience to do, feel, or know? And I'll turn it to Brian for the grant perspective on that.
Yeah, so this is a different kind of way of looking at it. And really what I'm trying to show on this slide is a continuum between the really good and in the nature of stories, the regal, and the not so bad, or the ones that deserve to hang out for a while. And the reason I did this was because as a grant reviewer, you have to score and rank applications typically, and that could be as simple as reading one, putting it in the middle of the table, reading the next one and saying, is this one better than that one or worse than that one, and putting it to one side. Very frequently, grant reviewers are given criteria and scoring considerations for each question, and those are publicly available as part of the grant application process. So you want to make sure that you elicit the response from the reviewer of, wow, that not only checks the boxes, but is really clear, gives me confidence that you know what you're doing and can pull it off, which gives the reviewer that, you know, incentive to put yours at the top of the list, versus plans that don't answer questions or grant applications that don't answer the questions completely. Then you kind of go, well, it didn't talk about this or that, and so I kind of have to put the application to the lower side of the pile. And so it's about eliciting not only an emotional response about checking the boxes and addressing everything in the question, and then doing it in a wow manner that puts you to the top of the list, because the top of the list always gets funded. The middle of the list sometimes gets funded, depending on how much money. The bottom of the list never gets funded. So trying to think of what else I wanted to say here. Remember that there are other applications out there, and you want your project to be the wow project, because it is generally competitive in grants. And so as a reviewer, you want them to go, yes, that's the one we need, because that A, meets our missions, what I talked about earlier, and B, is a really clear and complete answer to all the questions. And I think it's back to, so next, Laura. So the two pieces, as I thought about putting this together, that are really, as a grant reviewer and as a writer, I've learned is that when you provide information in response to a question, it needs to be both relevant and have context. And so when you write an answer to a question, put your reviewer hat on and ask, how is what I'm providing relevant to the question being asked? And then the next piece, Laura, if you want to go to the next one, is the context. And so very often grant questions will ask a question about, such as, you know, tell us why your team that you planned this with is the right group of people. And typically, in a lot of applications and plans, what I see is a list of meetings and a list of people. And as a reviewer, that's fine. That's a little helpful, but what I don't know, what the question is really asking is, why are those the right people to be in the room? Because I don't know your area as a reviewer. I'm depending on you to tell me why that set of people and that process you chose was the right process for your area. The other place that we see, or I've seen grant applications that are challenging to review, is the application might ask for the applicability of your project to other plans that are in existence, because the world we work in is full of plans, watershed plans and pollution abatement plans and everything else. And so again, what we want to be sure of is that A, we tell the reviewer what the plan is, you know, how the plan fits, but B, if you just say this is plan number 3 of 10 plans identified in this watershed, that's not giving context, because the reviewer is going to say, what happened to numbers 1 and 2, and why didn't you give us number 1? If number 1 and 2 were funded or underway or completed, tell the reviewer that this is number 3. We're just working down the order. And typically what I find is if I actually go to the plan, what's being reported is not the same as what's in the plan. So that's another place to be really, really careful, is to make sure that you're being factual in your portrayal of where your project fits in those plans. And I think I'm back to Laura.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, so if your audience is a decision maker or a leader, a lot of times what you're going to want them to do is somehow support your conservation district in the work that you're doing. And there's a lot of different ways that can look, but if you're asking for support for your conservation district representatives and commission representatives, we can only do so much. We aren't necessarily, if it's just us asking for support, we're not going to be as effective of a spokesperson, because even though we really care about this work, and you don't go into conservation to bring in the big bucks, you do it because you care, we all stand to somehow benefit from the support we're asking for. So it can seem like you're advocating, it's sort of self-advocating. We're just, they've got other things to do, they're busy, and hearing somebody advocate for something that they can personally benefit from isn't necessarily going to make them really grab at their heartstrings. But if what you are doing is asking for their support, if you can find somebody that you have assisted where your service to them made a difference to them, where if your conservation district didn't exist, that they could share, what they would have stood to lose without you, that's going to be a better call to action. That's something that's really going to take a hold of them. That can be a story that they can repeat to their other partners or other decision makers that they need on board with whatever that you're asking them to do. So that's really important when we're asking for support from decision makers. So then, once you've determined your audience and you know what you want them to do or feel, you've got a sense of how you might, or at least what direction you want them to take after you've connected with them, it's time to decide how you're going to draw out that emotional response. I'll turn it to Brian.
So once again, putting on the grant reviewer's hat, if the grant reviewer reads the question and identifies elements of the question they want to see in your answer and they don't see it, you get the grumpy dragon, or you get the big nasty pointy teeth from the rabbit. If the grant reader has to work really hard to get to what the answer to the question is, that's going to get a grumpy response and probably put you lower on the list. So I just think it's really good to put yourselves in their shoes. They have 20 of these or 50 of these to do, and you want to get right to the point and be direct. Provide, there's a balance in there. You need to provide enough documentation, and at the same time answer the question. I think one of the things that we struggle with as technical people is that we're trained to provide detail conclusion. Most of the rest of the world works the other way around. So bottom line up front, supporting information, and then a place for detail to go find more information at the end is typically going to be a better strategy. Provide context and answer the why, even if the grant question doesn't necessarily ask for it. Sometimes, again, maybe they were technical people that wrote the question. So really important to sit back and say, what is this question really asking? And then, as I've mentioned before, make sure you show that your proposal is going to meet the funder's needs more so than your own. Your grant application responses are a reflection of your entire project. As a reviewer, if you read a kind of a shoddy answer, you're like, that doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. So you want to make sure that you're providing good, clear answers. And I know we do grants applications typically in a rush, and even if we start a month ahead of time, it's still a rush the last couple of days. But really find time to have those external reviews and make sure that somebody that's less familiar with the project can understand what you're trying to get to. And I'm going to pass back to Laura.
Yeah, we've seen some really good examples from conservation districts of how to turn their stats into something that's going to elicit an emotional response. And one of those responses that can be most effective is when you can get somebody to sort of sit back in their seat and be surprised at what you're saying. And that really requires giving some context. So Palouse Conservation District came up with one for their Regional Conservation Partnership Program, their RCPP, that they've been running in their region around the tons of sediment that they've prevented from entering the Palouse River watershed. Instead of just saying 103,000 tons, which is hard for most people to conceptualize, they added this statement to it, that it is enough to fill dump trucks lined back to back from the Olympia Capitol to the Space Needle. That's enough to at least have somebody, not only are they now going to have a better concept of what that looks like and the scale of accomplishment, but it kind of makes you sit back in your seat a bit, like, wow, it's going to stick in your head. Whereas if you just said 103,000 tons of sediment, it doesn't mean that that's not a huge accomplishment. It is, but now it's in a way that somebody who's not related or directly involved with this work, it's really going to mean something to them. We've been trying to do that more at the Conservation Commission. In our materials, we did a look this year, I think it was the 20th anniversary of CREP last year, Brian, I think. Yeah. So we wanted to look at what has been accomplished through CREP so far. And we could just say, well, it's enhanced over 925 miles of salmon streams. That's a lot, but again, I don't know if that would really stick in my head until we add this. That's the distance from Seattle to the Grand Canyon. That gets a surprise dragon. At least it does for me. Even being involved in this work, when I saw that and was able to really think about what that means and see it on a map, that added context that sticks in my head. I remember now how many stream miles have been enhanced through that program because of that way of presenting it. And there's another way to do it. Thanks to North Yakima Conservation District and some other districts who have repeatedly said how we really needed a better way to communicate what technical assistance is. You can find narratives about it. There's tons of white papers on what technical assistance means, but it's just not resonating. And so another way to think about delivering a emotional response from somebody and really engaging your audience is to do it really visually. Try to transfer your a block of text into a visual. And so we created a set of steps where even if you don't read everything in here, even if you just read the things that are in all capitals and bold, you get a sense just from looking at this, like, wow, there's a lot of steps that have to take place before ground breaks on a conservation project. And that is what technical assistance goes to. That's a lot of work that needs to be done. So even if that's all they get out of it, even if they don't get into reading what all those steps are, the main concept of steps need to take place. There's a lot of them. It takes time, and people hopefully are communicated just by looking at a graphic in a way that wouldn't necessarily happen if you just handed them a block of text. And that's another thing when you're thinking about your audience is generally in this day and age, it's not just true for elected officials, it's true for everyone. They're pressed for time, and the more you can do to communicate things visually and at a glance, the better, both for making sure that they understand what you're saying and for the chance of making a stronger emotional kind of wow factor impact. So we're going to talk about some other resources and tips available to help you do that. I'll turn it over to Brian.
Yeah, this is a hard one for me because there are grant writing resources out there, and they're all somewhat similar. So I actually kind of just dug into, where I've come from, and the two things that really, and I mentioned it at the beginning, the two things that really, I think, made me understand this better as a technical person writing for an emotional or competitive audience is that one thing I learned really quickly on one of the first grants I applied for gave me the opportunity for a post-application review. Even if you're successful, it's worth asking your funder to see if they'll give you a post-application review so you know where you scored, you know what you did well on, you know what you need to improve on. And if they will give you your reviewer comments, that's even more helpful. And typically the reviewers are going to put you, look at your question and say, did great on this answer, I liked this part, I didn't like this part. If you have an unsuccessful application, it's just good information to understand about how you can present your project in a better way. The second thing I thought I'd put out here for a tip, and I know we're all pressed for time and we don't always get paid for it, we don't always get management support for it, but if you can help another agency be a reviewer in their grant processes, you will then step into the shoes of your audience, and that will make you a much better grant writer. I know that's not about how to use data, but it really is about how to convey information in a meaningful way. And I think I'm back to Laura. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Laura. Oh, one more? Oh, yeah. So this is one of the things I found. I'm a technical nerd, just like a lot of other folks out there. And so when I don't know the answer to something, like Laura said earlier, there's the magic of Google. And I found this little thing on a site called 2 Octobers, and I think it really fits with what we're trying to say here is begin with a question, end with an insight, tell a story, explain it. Laura's talked about some way to narrate that. Be honest and credible, some of the things I've talked about, be clear and concise. That's the piece about the relevance and about the context. Know your audience, that's doing your homework. Again, the wonders of Google, whether it's an elected official that you're trying to impress for funding, or doing your homework on an agency that has a grant program, or doing your research on your next job application. And then the last one about providing context, I think really can't say that enough, because you want your answers to your questions to answer questions, not elicit more. So. And now I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks. So most of you might already know this, but just in case, I wanted to make sure you know that something as simple as Google Maps, if you go into Google Maps and put in 2 locations, it'll give you the driving or walking, commuting directions. But if you right-click on the map and this little menu will pop up, and you can go down to the bottom, it says measure distance. That allows you to give the point-to-point distance between 2 places, which will be what you would want to use rather than having to clarify that the driving distance between this place and this place is the number of miles of stream enhanced. You can just say, like we did with the CREP example, that's the distance between Seattle and the Grand Canyon. An example I used here because I was feeling homesick for Sleeping Lady was Olympia to Leavenworth. Hopefully we can be there next year. Hopefully most of you are familiar that there is a marketing toolkit on the Commission's website And we do have some resources in there that could be helpful, including we have a worksheet for capturing effective testimonials from landowners. Just gives you some tips on, depending on who your audience is, what you want them to do, gives you some prompts into thinking about who would be an effective spokesperson for accomplishing what you want to accomplish and telling the story you want to tell. We also have a new, if you're starting to tell your story and anxious to get to it, but you still need, if it's an audience that's not familiar with your conservation district, just this year we put in, from the Communication Partnership and Outreach Group, we put in an elevator pitch template and word bank. So that way you can just take a small amount of time to effectively say what your conservation district is and why it's important, and then jump right into the story that you've come to tell. But there's a lot of resources in there to check out that could be helpful, including there's a gallery of vector images, or kind of like that logo graphic-y image that you can use for communicating your metrics. And so you can use that in there as well. But the other important thing, and we're hoping to actually turn this over to you guys, is I, before this presentation, was looking around to see if NRCS or any of our conservation partners have a one-stop shop where you could find a bunch of visual equivalents for commonly used metrics. So how many tons are in a typical dump truck? What are some good equivalents for a number of acres? Things like that, where we could just quickly have some good visuals that put a metric in context, and especially designed for conservation, typical conservation measures. And I couldn't find that. I've not seen that. I asked a few people, they hadn't either. And so it was something I'm kind of interested in creating, or thought might be helpful if there was something like that. But I also wasn't sure, is anybody out there seeing anything like that, where you would, just see some common metric equivalents for if you want to translate tons into dump trucks or acres into football fields, things like that. A one-stop shop where you could find a bunch of those metric equivalents. Has anybody seen anything like that? If you have, either type in the box or raise your hand on the GoToMeeting dashboard. I would love to hear if anybody's seen anything like that. Or anybody seeing any hands raised out there?
So Laura, we have a couple of things. I have a couple of things in the questions box, and then I'm gonna unmute Dana, who has a hand raised. Renee, let's see. Oh, Dana says water in swimming pool sizes and number of swimming pools. And
Yeah,
Laura
that'd
had
be
a
a great one.
question. Yeah, a very similar question. She said, or it said, Zora said, something I really struggle with is estimated load reductions, nutrient sediment with BMP installations. And again, are there resources for estimating load reductions from agricultural BMPs? So this is
Okay.
linked in, I guess, to the same kind of question.
Yeah. And I think, for all those things there are, and it would be great. Well, and I guess this is my assumption. I would turn it to you guys. Would it be helpful if there was something like that, where those common things, swimming pools, football fields, dump trucks, estimated load reductions, were all in one spot? We couldn't have all of it, but at least some of the more common ones would be available through the toolkit. Is that something that would be helpful, especially if we were able to have like a little graphic to go along with it if you choose to use it, have a dump truck there that you can just pop in, a football field? Is that something that would be helpful for everyone?
I'm seeing a lot of yeses in the comments box, and Kari has her hand raised. So do you have a question, Kari, or a comment?
Oh, I just wanted to say that, no, that sounds great, because I think those visuals are really super for us to share. So yes, Laura, please do.
Hey, thanks,
And
Kari.
this is Brian. One other thought too is, in your homework, especially to elected officials, it might be useful to find a reference that they know. So if I was talking to somebody in Pullman, I would say how many Joe Martin stadiums need to be filled in with sediment, or I'd pick something that they would know. And then that's part of putting your homework together along with the visual, because if they don't know your reference, the distance from, Tacoma to Everett or something isn't going to resonate with somebody from the eastern side of the state. But if you, in your homework, you can find something very specific and relevant to what they know, you're going to be way ahead of the game.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Brian. When we just started doing that, I wish I would have started doing this sooner. We started doing that this year, where if somebody was going to be meeting with somebody, for example, in the Spokane area, we'd convert, number of acres that had been, planted into how much. I think we had something over the life of a program, the number of acres planted would cover the entire city of Spokane, things like that, because it was a leader from that area. So we were giving them a geographic reference of square acres that they were really familiar with, that were within the community that they serve. So that's another really, really simple thing you can do, just Googling square acres of different areas within somebody's region that they're serving.
Nice. And Laura, Renee suggests adding it to the infographics area of the toolkit, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Great idea. Well, I'm going to look into that, because I think that'd be really, I know it'd be helpful for me, and it sounds like it'd be helpful for other folks. And if you guys have other, I hadn't thought about the swimming pool one, that's a great one. So if you have other measures that you have seen and were effective, let me know, and I'll just try to compile them into a resource that we can all use.
And Zora has a hand up. I'm gonna leave it open. If Zora, do you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I had kind of chimed in on that conversation, but I'd written it a little bit before. I was asking about estimated load reductions, but I was asking about it a little bit more technically. Since you guys are talking about, grant applications and things like that, I thought I'd mention that I struggle with knowing how to estimate load reductions. So not necessarily knowing how to represent those to political figures or whatever, but just knowing, okay, if I put in 4 manure storage facilities, how do I estimate what reductions? And I have no idea, like, how to even start that process, where to go to look at data for that sort of thing. So that's kind of what I was referring to. But I think that piece is important, because you need that part in order to be able to explain how many dump trucks you're doing.
Yeah, I can take that a little bit. There's 2 pieces of it. One is, especially in terms of loadings, you're obviously talking about precip, so understanding how to generate runoff values, which is your water piece. And then the other one is to understand how much your practice effectively reduces your pollutant loads. And so I don't know that there's any one source. I know when I'm looking at things, I'm looking at the hydrology and hydrography, which is the rainfall precip, and the hydrology, which is the runoff patterns, to get a volume of water. And then I'm looking at what my pollutant load is that I would estimate initially versus if I had a 50% reduction of that, how much would be reduced. And I really do find going towards the, once I can get that in hand, typically that's in concentration, which is relatively meaningless to a grant funder. So then if I can annualize that into a pounds and convert that pounds into something more representative, then I think you have a place to go. I mean, an example of that I would give is that when I was doing stormwater work in Yakima, we had questions about copper and brake pads, and Southern California has been wrestling with this issue for quite a while, to the point where they're working with the manufacturers to reduce the amount of copper and brake pads, which means they're destroying car rotors in the process, but a different problem. But I actually was able to say, okay, so how much concentration is there of copper in a brake pad? How many households are in Yakima? You know, can I do some kind of back of the napkin estimates and get to an amount, you know, if brake pads last 5 years, you know, how long does that, how much, and add that all up. And I came up with 400 pounds of copper in a year, which if you think about it, it's like, well, that's okay. But, you know, coming from each and every little collected brake pad in the Yakima area, but I thought about it and I said, what if somebody took 400 pounds of copper in the back of a pickup and backed up to the boat ramp and just let it go? Would people be incensed about that? Hopefully they would. But yeah, it took some detective work and it took some understanding of just making some reasonable assumptions about what the pollutant load was, what the runoff carrying ability was for your area, and then what your BMP reduction is in terms of percentage. And sometimes that's as good as we can get because the literature's all over there. There's information in the stormwater world that's probably better at that than in the ag world. We're working a lot on BMP effectiveness right now with Ecology's effort, with CTD's efforts, because this is one area of that storytelling that we're really, really struggling with, is how much does each single BMP remove, and therefore what does the sum total remove, and how does that help the environment? I know that's not a direct answer, but it hopefully helps kind of get the wheel spinning.
Well, I think it kind of highlights, thank you, Brian, for that. I think it kind of highlights you are a very science-minded and technical person, and I think that you're very good at being able to figure those things out. And while I appreciate your answer, my head just sort of started buzzing a little bit, which isn't a reflection on your abilities to explain. It's a reflection on my abilities to understand this. But that being said, I feel like for myself, I really struggle with quantifying how much impact our work has, not because I can't make it relatable, but because I literally have no idea, because grantors keep asking me, well, how many pounds of whatever, or what's the load reduction? And I've done some research and I just hear buzzing. And I'd like to think I'm not the only person that struggles with that. So I don't.
No, you're not. And part of it is that we work at such a granular scale compared to other projects, because a lot of projects are watershed based. We're working on a parcel base, and our relative contribution is really, really tiny. And so sometimes it's hard to make each piece seem significant, but it is additive and it is cumulative. So maybe noted, and definitely I think that's something we can work on helping make the case for the work that you guys do.
Thank you.
I think it's a great point, Zora, and maybe we can work with, I'll have some notes after this, between the Conservation Commission and CTD, there might be some resources already available, or identifying that as a gap to work on. So I'll make sure to put that in some of the notes from this. Well, this is Meg again. I realize we're a few minutes before noon. I do want to pass it back to Laura and Brian for some, final comments, but also we're at lunch at noon, so we don't have a talk right after this. So anyone that would like to stick around for longer, we have a couple more questions in the questions box, and if anyone has other questions they'd like to ask, I'm happy to stick around as long as people are interested in having a good conversation. So, Laura,
thanks, Meg. Yeah, we I don't think we have anything else to add. It's just, the example that Brian just gave of, providing the context of, trucks dumping copper into the water. That's really exactly the point that we were hoping to make. And I think before we came on, Brian was saying to me, like, no, nothing that we're talking about today is rocket science. Our goal was just to really inspire people to think about, how you how you make numbers have an impact. And some of you are already doing this incredibly well, and I would love to see more examples of how you've done this, so that we can all help each other, because it's something we're all working at and all trying to get better at, including our partners. I know NRCS has been devoting more time and resources into this, trying to translate their metrics as well. So as a conservation family, I think we're just hoping to keep this conversation going and share resources so that we can all do a good job with this. Do you have anything else to add, Brian?
No, I don't, but I noticed the last slide we cut off my phone number, or I didn't put it in, so it's on the website, or it's 407-7103 is the rest of that number that should be there. Speaking of,
yeah, happy to stay on for right. Happy to stay on for any questions that anybody has or discussion that people want to have.
Thank you, Laura and Brian. That was wonderful. I've gotten a few comments that people really love the theme as well.
Yay!
Yay!
I wanted to remind everybody that's listening too, if you didn't have a chance to take notes on everything, this is recorded and will be added to the WADE website. So you can go back and look through and remind yourself of some of the tips and tricks that they were sharing. And then at 1 o'clock, we'll be back with Alan Warren from Pierce CD presenting on the Successful Orca Recovery Day.
Awesome. So I do have a couple of comments and questions from early in the talk. Kelly McCaffrey says, compliments the spreadsheet for legislators and committees, says it's a great reminder for summer messaging and outreach to decision makers, and has a question, was it just an example or can you share it so that we could use it to build our own?
Oh, I'd be happy to share it. Yeah. Is the best way for me to send it to folks at CTD, or
I think
so they can post it along with our presentation, or?
I think probably, and then I'll keep notes of, I think there will be a list of attendees that were participating. It could go out specifically to this group. I don't know exactly how that works. Kelly also has another question. Kelly says to make connections to the audience, testimonials work really well, especially having a range of people that the audience would resonate with, and asks, do you have any advice or suggestions on strategy around acquiring testimonials?
Yeah, I would say that testimonial worksheet that's in our marketing toolkit, that's something that the communications group reviewed a few years ago. But the thing that I like about it, it kind of talks you through thinking of a strategy for your testimonial based on your audience and what you're wanting to accomplish. And then kind of thinking about who's available to deliver your message most effectively. But then there's also a section of questions. I think there's 10 different questions that you can ask, that you don't want your testimonial to be scripted. You want it to be really in their own words. But you can, and I think it's actually most effective to provide some examples of questions that they might want to answer in their testimony, whether they're planning written testimony or writing a letter. Just providing a few, not all 10, but selecting a few of those questions from that 10 question list on the worksheet can just provide some really good prompts to get the most impactful statement you can from your cooperator.
And the same
Brian,
thing
do you have
applies on the
anything
grant.
from the,
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this as we were preparing, and the same thing applies to the grant world as well, because very often grants ask for support from cooperators, or letters indicating support for the project so it's ready to go. And as a reviewer, just supplying them and checks the box. But if all the applications check the box, then how does the reviewer put one above the other? And so I think the things Laura said is provide questions for people to answer, but don't provide the form, because if all the letters look alike and say the exact same thing, then you know, all the applications do that. So how do you make your set of support letters stand out from the other applications? And the principles Laura was talking about exactly apply to grant writing in the same way. You know, three well-written support letters are better than 20 form letters.
Any
Great.
other questions?
I'm not seeing any in the questions box. If folks have any last minute questions they'd like to answer, a reminder, you can raise your hand. Well, I think that's a wrap for today then. Laura and Brian's contact information is obviously there. And again, I'm going to leave this room, quote unquote, open through lunch. So you're welcome to stay on or rejoin with the same link for the 1 o'clock, or yeah, the 1 o'clock presentation.
All right, thanks so much, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And yeah, please just let us know if you have more questions.
Yeah, thank you. And if you guys have questions or want, you know, some thoughts about grants you're working on or whatever, don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you, Laura and Brian.